The world called him a failure, a drunk, a warmonger. But in this room, he fought two wars, one against tyranny, the other against the darkness inside himself. Born to aristocracy, raised in silence. Even in a palace, he felt like a guest in his own life. They called him stupid because letters danced before his eyes. But in that shame, a fire was born. While others slept, he read of battles and empires, not to escape, but to prepare. He learned early, if no one listens, write so loudly the world can't ignore you. Even among family, he was an island. Love wasn't given. It had to be earned through achievement. He chose the army not for glory, but for structure. A place where effort, not birth, defined a man. In the roar of battle, he found his voice. Not with words, but with action. He turned bullets into bylenes. War correspondent by day, politician in waiting by night. His first election speech drew 10 men. But he spoke as if addressing a nation, because he knew one day he would. He rose like a comet, brilliant, bold, impossible to ignore. By 30, he'd crossed party lines, defied kings, and reshaped a nation's conscience. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he dreamed of a swift end to war and naval strike that would knock the Ottoman Empire out in weeks. Genius or hubris? The plan failed, not with screams, but with silence. Thousands landed. Few returned. And all eyes turned to the man who said it would work. Overnight, the visionary became the villain. Whispers in corridors replaced standing ovations. Even allies turned their backs. He wrote letter after letter, apologies, explanations, please, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, his pen failed him. He resigned from cabinet and walked into the mud of the front lines. Not to lead, but to atone. In the mud, he found his voice again, not for speeches, but for truth. And truth, he knew, was the only weapon that never rusted. He turned shame into pages, failure into legacy, and slowly, the world began to listen again. But peace made him irrelevant. The man who saved empires was now just another ghost on the sidewalk. While Britain celebrated peace for our time, he saw the storm behind the smile. And no one believed the man they'd already buried. He waited. Not for glory, but for the moment the world would finally see what he'd seen all along. The call came at dawn, not because they trusted him, but because there was no one else left to trust. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Not a promise of victory, but a vow that Britain would never kneel. While others planned retreat, he planned resistance. Not with hope, but with sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He begged Roosevelt for tools of war, for conquest, but for survival. And across the ocean, a lifeline began to form. His voice became Britain's armor. Not loud, but unbreakable. And every word was a brick in the wall against surrender. While bombs fell, he watched not to command, but to share the fear. A leader who refused to hide. He didn't just lead a government, he led a spirit. And in every shelter, his words lived in the quiet courage of ordinary people. In private, he carried the weight alone. But in public, he turned exhaustion into energy, doubt into defiance. He called them the few, but the many built the wings that saved the skies. He didn't need to command every battle. His presence alone was a signal. The fight continues. After the Blitz, London stood not because it was unbreakable, but because one man refused to let it break. With America finally in the war, he knew the tide would turn, but victory would demand unthinkable alliances and moral compromises. He shook hands with a tyrant to defeat a monster, not because he believed in him, but because the world had no cleaner choice. Day loomed, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. As the sky filled with planes, Britain held its breath. The longest day had begun. The war in Europe was won. But as the bells rang, he knew the price of victory was the world he once knew. The people cheered the hero, then voted him out. Freedom won, but the cost was his own political life. They thanked him with cheers, then replaced him with promises. But in silence, he began his final battle to shape how history would remember the truth. His weapon now was memory, and every word was a stone laid in the foundation of legacy. He warned of a new tyranny not with armies, but with words. And once again, the world called him alarmist. Until it wasn't. In birds and blossoms, he found a peace politics never gave him. The war was over, but the mind never truly rests. They gave him the Nobel Prize, not for peace, but for words that armed a generation against despair. They called him Bagnot because they needed his policies, but because they needed his symbol. And symbols, he knew, outlive men. He walked the same streets that once roared his name. Now, only the river remembered his voice. Even in weakness, his mind refused to surrender. For the battle wasn't over, it had just changed fronts. He sat for portraits, not for vanity, but to say, "This is what endurance looks like." History paints in broad strokes. But he knew the truth lived in the fine lines, the doubts, the fears, the quiet nights. In the laughter of children, he found the future he'd fought for. And for the first time, he let himself rest. He outlived kings, empires, and enemies. But time, he knew, was the only victor. He left no grand farewell, just an empty chair, and words that refused to die. Today, children leave flowers for a man they never knew. But his voice still whispers in every choice to stand, when surrender would be easier. That night, he didn't write for history. He wrote for you the one who'd, one day, face your own darkness. And need to remember, never give in. 3 words repeated like a drumbeat. Not for armies, but for the lonely heart at 3 a.m. His words outlived empires, because truth doesn't need power, it only needs to be read. In every generation, someone picks up the book and finds they're not alone in the fight. They teach his speeches not for rhetoric, but for courage they can't find in textbooks. He didn't save Britain with armies alone. He saved it with a voice that turned fear into fuel and silence into song. His finest hour wasn't in 1940. It's every time someone chooses to stand. When running would be easier. Cities rise and fall, but words outlive stone. He's gone. But the chair remains, waiting for the next voice that refuses to be silent. His story ended. Yours is still being written. What will you write when the darkness comes? Subscribe. Not for more history, but for more voices that refuse to surrender.